Well, welcome everybody to part 3 of Intro to VCarve. Tonight we're going to be looking at vector editing and management and a lot more. But to start out tonight, what I actually want to start out with is a bit of a review and a deeper dive into some of the toolpath stuff we talked about. Last week, we spent most of our time talking about the tool database, and tonight I want to talk more about the tool paths themselves. In particular, we're going to take a look at these three to start with. There are some similarities and some differences between them. And when you understand these, it helps you decide which one to use, and also realizing that the differences are because of what they do. They're different tool paths, they do different things, and some of the settings are different and some are the same. So to start with, we've got a profile toolpath on the left, the pocket in the middle, and the VCarve on the right. These are three of the most common toolpaths you'll be using outside of maybe 3D carving if you're doing 3D carving. And the first two in most woodworking shops, those are pretty much, they limit almost all their use to those two for most of the production work. But we've got what's called cutting depth, and I've highlighted that. You can see how cutting depth in the profile toolpath and the pocket depth means the same thing. It's how deep it's going to cut. However, in the VCarve, similar settings referred to as flat depth. So in the pocket in the middle here, we have a 3/8 inch cut depth. So we're cutting technically 3/8 of an inch deep. The VCarve is cutting 1/4 inch deep. And over here for the profile, we're cutting 0.77, which is all the way through the 3/4 inch material. We talked a bit about that last time. However, if we take another look at this, you can swap things up to where the profile toolpath, you don't need to cut all the way through. You could set that at 3/8 of an inch deep if you just wanted a groove. And technically speaking, you could use the pocket toolpath to actually cut that entire area out. In fact, that is kind of a practical solution. There's sometimes, I'm going to say, like if it's under an inch, maybe even under 2 inches, there are some situations where if I'm cutting out a little round area, rather than using the profile toolpath to cut out a disc, if I cut out a disc, then I probably have to add tabs, which are going to leave little marks on the inside. And if I don't want to do that, sometimes I'll actually just spend a little extra time with the cutting and use the pocket toolpath and cut that entire area away and just turn it into sawdust, let it get sucked up the dust collector, and it's out of my way. So it is an option that you can do. It does take longer, but it is another possibility. So you actually, as you see here, you can change things up a little bit with those two toolpaths. With VCarve, the flat depth, the purpose of that is that if you were to take the flat depth off in this bottom illustration, you can see how the V-carving will actually cut all the way through the material. And if you ever look at it, we kind of looked at it last week, you can see where it cuts a very deep V, it would cut right into your table. So that's when you get this pop-up warning you that it's going to cut deeper than your material is thick. And you have to make a decision then whether it's, if it's just a little bit or if it's a lot. Especially with V-carving, you want to pay attention to this warning. You'll get the same warning when you set it up like this 0.77 on 3/4 inch material. But if you have a spoil board, then that 20 thousandths isn't a problem. So you can ignore that warning. But on the VCarve, when you get pop-up warnings like that, understand what they mean and whether you can ignore them or not. It'll save you some headache at your machine. Next up, this is where we were last week most of the time, the select button. And the select button opens up the tool database. And as you can see, all three of these toolpaths have a select button, which will take you into your tool database. And that's where you would pick your particular bit. And whatever settings are inside your tool database are the settings that will then be applied to that toolpath. However, you have an override. We talked a little bit about this too, which is the edit button. And the edit button will bring up a mini edit screen, a small edit screen that you see at the bottom of each of these windows, where you can edit the setting for that bit just for the single occurrence. So it doesn't affect the default settings of the tool database. It only affects this particular toolpath. So if there's anything you want to change about it, but you don't want to change your primary or your default settings in the tool database, then you can do it through the edit button. Another common setting you'll see in just the first two toolpaths, the profile and pocket, are the edit pass steps, or the edit the number of passes. And that'll pop up this secondary window. And the easiest way to edit your passes, if you want to go from 8 to 7 or 6, is down here at the bottom. It says number of passes. Click up or down and increasing or decreasing the passes, and then make sure and hit the set button or the set passes. If you don't hit set, it will not apply your changes. There are some other interesting advanced settings in here. Go ahead and explore those as well. You can change up to where each of these thicknesses are different. You can set a small pass at the end. There's a lot of flexibility within that. But the basic setting here at the bottom is the one that I find myself using the most often if I want to go from 10 to 8 or something for passes. Next up, the profile toolpath has the unique option of going inside, outside, or on the line. The pocket and V-carve toolpath always go, they always flatten out an entire area. So there's no real inside, outside the line setting with those two toolpaths. But the profile one gives you that basic option. Again, think of it kind of like a bandsaw. You're cutting inside, on, or outside the line, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. The other thing that's a little unique about the profile toolpath is you have a last pass setting. And if you check that checkbox, you can then set up an offset to where the first few passes, just like that little picture shows, the first few passes will be set away from your finished cut by however much you enter. And typically something like 10 thousandths, 0.01, in most cases works fine. And then the last pass comes back and goes right up to your vector and takes the whole side of the material away. I refer to this as a jointing cut because it gives you the smoothest finished cut around the outside. It's particularly useful if a shape like you have, like this disc here, if the edge is really critical to be smooth. For something like a cabinet where the edges are going to be held, or if you're cutting it out and sanding it later or profiling it on your router table, then this setting isn't as necessary, but it is available there. Also, of course, we talked about tabs before, and the tabs can be set based on these dimensions, and that's another unique part of the profile toolpath, that the others don't have tabs available. However, the other two allow you to set up additional bits within the same toolpath. This sometimes confuses people, but let's take a look at the V-carve side first. If you look here at the top, we have a 90-degree half-inch bit set up. And then checking this box, we add a clearance bit of 1/4. So this produces two toolpaths, one for the 1/4 inch and one for the V-bit. The 1/4 inch toolpath does the majority of the roughing. That's why it's called a clearance tool. It clears out the majority of the wood, and then the V-bit comes back for the second toolpath and does the final carving on that design. In a pocket toolpath, it's a similar sort of feature where we start with a 1/2 inch end mill and go to a 1/4 inch. And as you can see, the 1/4 inch goes back and adds more detail because it's able to get into some of these areas in a tighter fashion. Now, when you add these extra bits and these windows here, realize that they just start to stack up, and you have to manually remove them. So if I wanted to add, say, an 1/8 inch and get rid of the 1/4 inch, I have to highlight the 1/4 inch and click remove. So whenever you go to your pocket toolpath, whatever you used here last usually defaults. So if you just keep adding bits by selecting, you'll get a whole list of bits here, but it's easy to get rid of the extra ones by clicking on remove. So it tends to default to what you used the last time. So every so often I'll get somebody ask me, how come I've got 3 tool paths? I only want 2. And that's usually why. Some of the settings in the lower part of the window also are highlighted depending on which bit you have selected on both of these sides. If you highlight the bit, you can then edit the passes, and there's some other information below there too that you could edit for that for each bit separately. The other thing that Pocket and VCarve toolpaths have in common, because they're clearing out an entire area, is the offset or raster arrangement. Now, the offset, as you can see from the diagram right there, it's a spiral type cut. Starts in the middle, usually, and spirals out. Whereas the raster goes back and forth in a straight line. Now, the raster, you can change the raster angle. Right now, 0 is left to right, back and forth. But if you change that to 90, it'll go vertical, and you can do 45. You can do whatever angle you like. What I usually find when I'm using the raster on a finished cut, whether it's the Pocket toolpath or the V-carving, or even the 3D carving, is I like to raster with the grain, because any router marks or scratches with the grain are much easier to sand out, and they're much less visible as well. The offset is a good application if you're doing MDF or roughing. The timing between the two, it's pretty close. I haven't found that that's a big issue. But the rastering is very handy when you're doing the finish cutting. You want to go with the grain and leave the smoothest finish, whereas the offset will definitely leave some cross-grain marks. The other thing we have in here is what's called climb and conventional. Now, conventional cutting is like if you held a handheld router and you go against the rotation of the bit, that's the safe way to use a handheld router. Just like on your router table, you push the wood against the rotation of the bit. That's conventional. And that's a great, on the CNC, that's a good option if you're doing MDF, plywood, composites, plastic. Conventional is a good default direction. For most solid wood, though, the climb is a better option. And on the CNC, you don't have any concerns of the machine kicking back at you. You know that on a router table, if you went with the rotation of the router bit, or a handheld router, you went with the rotation of the router bit, it could throw the board right out of your hand or the machine. But on the CNC, the climb cut will often leave less chipping around the edges and the corners. So it's a good option when you're using solid wood. The other setting that's available in all 3 tool paths is the ramp. And we mentioned earlier that the ramp is kind of like a boat ramp going into the water. It eases the bit into the material. So whenever you're using tool setup, if the ramp option is available, sometimes it gets grayed out depending on how you're set up. But if it is available, the safest option, the most common option, if you look over here on the left side, you've got what's called smooth, and that's what we see up here. It's just a even ramp going in, and then set a distance. And on the small desktop machines, I usually find 2 to 4 times the diameter the bit works. On larger machines, they will sometimes go 10 times the diameter because they're cutting through the entire thickness of the material, 3 inches or even, or I mean, 3/4 of an inch or even thicker. And so they want to spend a long time easing that bit into it. But for most benchtop tools, we're rarely cutting more than an 1/8 inch deep. So you can usually get down in that distance in about an inch. It works out pretty well. And you have the same settings over on these other ones as well. For larger bits, larger diameter bits, obviously, again, you're going to go to a longer length on that ramp. In the V-carve, the ramp only applies to the clearance bit. So if you're not using a clearance bit, then you won't see that option. One of the last very unique aspects of all these tool paths Down at the bottom, there's something called Project Toolpath onto 3D Model. So I've got this apple here that's carved out a 3D model, and you can see how you could actually apply a 1/4 inch deep toolpath. It'll go up over the model and back down. Same with the pocket and same with the lettering. So particularly for lettering, this is a fun application. If you have some 3D carving that you want to put lettering or some sort of other V carving on top of it, it'll actually conform to the surface. It can get a little weird along the steep edges, but otherwise it does a pretty nice job. Any question at this point on these 3 toolpaths from anybody, from what I've covered here, about any of these settings? What other item then that's worth looking?
Oh, I'm sorry. I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So I know you were talking about when you have like 2 different bits, and I've never done a file where I would have 2 different bits. But
Okay.
will the machine stop you? Like, will it stop the run? Like after it does like 1 bit, will it stop so that you can change it and put the other bit in? Like, does it prompt you for that?
So when you save your toolpaths, each bit will require its own toolpath tap file that you're saving to your thumb drive or your computer. So when it finishes running, we got a good example coming up here, but once I finish carving, let's say the apple, the router will just come to stop. And because you're done carving the apple, then you'll have to bring up the toolpath for the profile one, and then it'll carve that one separately. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, like basically you just have files for each bit that you use so
Yes.
that the machine stops because it completed that file.
Yes, yes. It's not
Perfect.
going, the machine's not going to know that it needs another file. That's for you to determine, but it will stop
Okay.
at the end of each file, and then you start the next file.
Okay, awesome.
So-
Thank you.
So each time you change the bit, you got to do your zeroing of your Z axis, right?
Excellent point, Bruce. Yeah.
Okay.
The XY, once you zero your XY, let's say the XY was in the middle of this apple. Once you zero that XY, and assuming you don't bump your machine or turn it off or something weird doesn't happen, that XY will be remembered by the tool. But when you put a new bit in, that tip of the bit's going to be at a different height. So you do need to re-zero the Z every time you put a new bit in. One other area in here that's
Hey,
worth exploring, if you're looking at some advanced features, this area right here, there's some other tabs here. The order one is kind of interesting. If you have a lot of vectors you're cutting at the same time, it'll cut them in a certain order. But I'll let you explore that. I'll just point that out to you at this point.
Hey, Randy,
Yes.
question on the profile pass. Now, I don't see it on your screen here, but on my Pocket Toolpath, I have an option of selecting the profile pass on this.
Of selecting
The profile pass for the Pocket, whether I want to do it before it starts the Pocket or after.
Yes, I know what you're referring to. It's right here. It's grayed out right now.
Yes.
So it says right here, profile pass and raster angle. These are grayed out because I'm set up to an offset cut right here. If I were to set this up to raster, then these two would not be grayed out. Let me go back a slide or two. Let me see if I've got that on one of the other slides. I don't, well, you see, I'm set up to an offset. That option, this raster angle and final pass don't only show up if you have it set to raster.
Okay.
And what this refers to, now the raster angle we talked about already, that's pretty obvious what that is. This profile pass, what that is, when you have it set up to raster, the router bit just goes straight back and forth. So the edge along the cut gets scalloped. And so the final pass that goes around and cleans that up, the profile pass. And this option, which is great, allows you to do it last, at the beginning, or not at all.
And what do you recommend?
I usually do, well, it depends on if I'm cutting like some solid wood, I'll sometimes do it first just to get that area cleaned up all the way around. If I don't have a real strong preference on that. I usually do it first though, but last is fine as well.
Thank you, Randy.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else before we move on? Well, now I want to take a closer look at V carving. And this is actually a multi-tool path project that's going to use all the 3 tool paths we just talked about, but I'm going to use some custom settings to show you how to actually create a pocket and then do carving down inside that pocket, like this little tray that we have right here. For starters, it's important to understand that we are set up with the Z0 to the top of the board, and this is the starting depth for all these projects right now. You see where it says 0, 0, 0, they all have starting depth up here. But for this particular project, the first thing I'm going to do is use the pocket tool path. I'm going to set the cut depth to 0.375, which will then cut this pocket inside this board. And that's called the cut depth. The starting depth is still set at 0 because we're zeroing to the top of this board. For all 3 of these bits, we will 0 to the top of the board because that's where the Z0 is set up in our job setup. The second bit, however, notice the very top setting. It says 375 for the start depth. So it's going to start 375 below the surface of the wood because that's where this pocket starts. And then it's going to cut to 1/8 of an inch deep. So what that does is it drops that ball nose bit down 3/8 of an inch, and then it starts cutting the 1/8 inch cut depth. So it's both a little trick and a little tricky the first time you work with this to understand how this math works. But remember, everything is measured from the top of the board. And the default start depth, as I've said before, is 0 because that's where your Z0 is. But in this case, we want the start depth to drop down to the bottom of the pocket and start cutting that groove. And then for the V bit, we do the same thing. We go ahead and start depth at 375. That drops the V bit down to the bottom of the pocket. But remember, you're still going to Z0 the V bit and the ball nose bit off the surface of the board. In this case, we're just doing this simple outline of this leaf, so there's no need to set a flat depth because it's a pretty shallow cut. And of course, all 3 of these bits then, not only because they're different bits, but because it's different tool paths, they will also be saved out individually, and then you would just run them in the order that we created them. I want to talk a little bit about setting up
Hey,
V-bit.
Randy,
Yeah, go ahead.
so when you said you have to save each tool path separate,
In this case, you would save each tool path. When you save it out of VCarve, it would come out as a separate tap file for the Sharp tool or the separate G-code file.
so you have 3 separate tap files saved. How does that display when you put it into your pendant?
So it depends. So we'll start with the Pocket tool path. The default name of that will be called Pocket, and you can rename it if you like. What I like to do, I don't have an example here, but what I like to do is I like to name my tool paths in the order that I'm going to run them. So I'll typically, I'll work up something next time too, but what I typically, for like this one, I would give it, say, TR for tray. I just use a couple of letters for the beginning. That way all the TRs line up together. And then after that, I would go TR01 pocket. And that would be this middle toolpath. And then I would have TR02 for profile toolpath and TR03 V-carve for the third toolpath. And I'd have those three toolpaths. When you bring those into the pendant, they may or may not show up in the pendant in numerical or alphabetical order. And that's why I like to have them numbered. I gave an illustration of one of the previous webinars I did where I had 5 different toolpaths and they were neither alphabetical nor numerically ordered in the pendant. It just has to do with how the technology works. It gets kind of confusing because in V-carve in the software, the toolpath side, there is no default order. You can sort those whatever order you want, move them up or down. There is no automatic sorting in V-carve. The only sorting is that when you create one, it usually goes to the bottom, but not always. And then when you save with your computer is like your thumb drive in your computer. There you're going to view them. It'll either sort of numerically or alphabetically, depending on how they're labeled. Then when you bring them to the pendant, it tends to go into the pendant a combination of what order they were saved in and what size the file is. And I haven't figured out there's necessarily a rhyme or reason to it. So that's why what I usually do with the pendant, I'll just number them all the time so I know what order to cut them in.
So I have another question. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but I know we talked about how like each time you change the bit, you zero your Z out, but you wouldn't need to re-zero your X and Y. Like that should still be set from like the first bit that you do. Is that right?
Absolutely correct. As long as you haven't bumped your tool or turned it off or something odd like that hasn't happened, as long as the tool has been running normally, it remembers where the XY is for that project.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. So here are examples of 3 different typical V bits. These are 3 that I use. Actually, the 2 on the right are the ones I use most often. But usually what you'll find available is a carbide tip V bit. And these bits work fine. The one thing to look for and that I have found is that sometimes you'll have a single piece of carbide like this one is sharpened on both sides. So it does more of a scraping cut than an actual shearing cut when it cuts. So it doesn't leave quite as crisp of line as these other 2, but they're inexpensive, readily available. The more critical thing here to look for is whether that tip is actually really sharp. You'll find there is another type of V-bit out there which actually has 2 pieces of carbide and they're sharpened like a typical bit with opposite bevels. You have to check that tip to make sure that it is really truly pointed. Oddly enough, I started using V-bits probably, 15 years ago with these machines. And back then, Rockler sold this blue version of their own shop variety. It was a cheap Taiwanese made bit, but actually they got that grinding so nice that even though it was a cheap bit, it was still really good grind. And oddly enough, Freud, which makes a name brand bit, for years their grind on that tip was really poor. And I even talked to them because I've been to their factory, I've done teaching for them, and I said, you guys got a big market out there, but you got to improve the tip on your bit. And since then they have improved the grind of it. But if you're not getting good crisp cuts, that's one thing to consider, is where that tip of your bit is nice and sharp. My go-to bit these days for most general V carving is this Amana bit. It's an insert bit, has a very sharp edge on it, very sharp point. It's a single flute. It looks like 2 flutes here, but one of them is offset. So it's really a single flute, which means it gets really good chip load. Because it's an insert bit, the carbide on this is actually a higher quality than the carbide on the tipped bit. The only thing that's challenging about it is when you rotate this tip to get a new cutting edge, getting this screw set back exactly where it needs to be is a little tricky. There are some directions that come with the mat and show you how to do it. It takes a couple little trial and error. But I love that bit. It's really cheap. It's about $35, and these inserts are only about $5 a piece. And I do a lot of V carving, so it's kind of my go-to bit. The other one I really like are what are called engraving bits. They said they really are a V bit. This one you can see has a little flat tip on it. That's a pretty big flat tip. The ones that I have are called 50,000 tip on it. They're made by Ansrud. And there are some other brands out there in a similar fashion. But again, it's a single flute, solid carbide. I have these mostly at 60 degree and 30 degree bits for real fine cutting. They have a very sharp edge for very fine engraving. And that little flat tip, like I said, this is a much larger tip, flat tip that I use. But the 50,000 one that I use, you can't even see it has a flat tip on it. And so I really like that for fine engraving, small lettering.
Randy, I have a question about that engraving bit.
Yeah.
I use a, I don't know if you can see this. This is a branding iron that just says, handcrafted by Gene and Bruce Frey.
Yep.
And sometimes if I'm painting something, the branding just gets obliterated. You can't see it. And if I want to put my name on a small item, would I use this engraving bit?
Yep.
Okay.
I've done lettering down to a 1/4 inch tall. It's pretty small, but you can do it with that bit.
All right.
Part of it's going to depend on the kind of material you're cutting it in. Some materials are going to cut better than others. You might even try pre-finishing the material. That sometimes, like, varnishing it or shellacking it, sometimes it hardens up the surface a little bit and keeps from tearing out a little bit.
Okay.
But it's a great bit. You can find them on Amazon. I think I've got a link out at my website where you can find a link to the ones that I use as well.
Okay, very good.
Yep. So the toolpath setup, this again was where we were last week, but we mostly just talked about end mill bits and the ball nose bits. The V bit setup is a little different. You've got your basic geometry that you're going to set just like with any bit. But then the part that's unique is this part right here is the pass depth. Again, it's important to realize that the pass depth, that the top of the cut is going to be twice typically what the depth is. Especially on a 90 degree bit, it's going to be exactly twice. So if I'm going 50 thousandths deep, like I have right here, the width at the top of the V is going to be 10 thousandths, almost 1/8 of an inch. So that's a good amount of material that's being taken out. So I go pretty conservative on my pass depth with most V bits. And again, depending on the kind of material. I think once we talked a little bit about this earlier, but the step over, the final pass and the clearance pass, the 2 and 20%, just leave those at the default. The difference between those, again, we looked at this last week, but here's another illustration, is that the 20% on the left side there is where it really is just roughing it out. And then the 2%, if you're using the bit actually to clear out the whole bottom, like let's say if the star was only 1 inch in diameter, then it makes no sense to use a clearance bit on there. So you could clear out the whole area with that, but then the 2% goes back and cleans up the bottom. But if you ever when you watch it do the V carving, one thing that's kind of almost magical about it is how the bit actually lifts up in the corners and cleans out the rough cutting in the corner to give you a very crisp corner. So it's important to understand how that works, because we're going to look at a slide here in a little bit, but if your depth isn't set correctly with your zeroing of the Z, or if your board isn't clamped down level, these corners won't come out as crisp as they should. The last setting is very typical to the other ones we've talked about. 20,000, that's a pretty common feed or spindle speed for V-bits. 20 to 22,000 on any of the Shark tools works fine. Feed rate, depending on which tool you have, but 120, even 150 could work well. The chip load is a relative number. You can see though, we're still within that functional size that we talked about last time. And then when you save that out, you're going to get a single V-carving toolpath for that project. However, as we saw earlier, you can also add that clearance tool. And in this case, we're going to add a 1/4 inch end mill for the clearance. We've got it set up here at offset. And what that bit does, the 1/4 inch bit goes in and clears out the middle of the area. As you can see here, I'm going rastering back and forth. I could use offset for this also. And right now, as you can see, I'm actually rastering against the grain. So if I was to go back and do this for real, I'd probably want to change that to 90 degrees. So the rastering was going with the grain, because in this case, that end mill bit is doing the final cutting on the bottom of that star. So what you end up with from the end mill is what you will get. The V-bit part, well, first before we leave here, you can see now we have 2 tool paths, and these are created from the one setup. This time sometimes throws people a curveball because they're, well, where'd my 2 tool paths come from? Well, if you click on either of these, it will actually go back and open up this setting where you can see you have 2 bits within the one toolpath window. So that's where it's coming from. In fact, if I added another bit, like an 1/8 inch bit in here or a 1/2 inch bit in here, I would end up with 3 tool paths in this window, and I would run them in the order that they appear. The V-bit part of it, when you have a clearance bit set up, the V-bit just comes around and does the profile around the edge. And that's where you can save a lot of time with V carving. So in this case, let's say that star is probably more like 6 inches across, and that makes sense to use a 1/4 inch bit to clear out the bottom of that. Any questions about that 2-bit setup with V carving? Give it a try. You'll find it very helpful. You just got to keep track of your toolpaths accordingly. And that's where if you, depending what how you're naming your project, these are just the default names that show up. Like I said, I usually would go back and number them, give them a little prefix of some initials for the project or something like that to keep track of them. Now, there are some special considerations with V carving that you'll find helpful to get the most out of this toolpath. The first one is to understand that the angle has an effect on how the carving looks at the end. On the left side, you can see the different V-bits. You can see the vectors that actually drew those vectors to illustrate this. And then the right side is the simulation. Now, I didn't do a flat bit with any of these, and you can see in the top up here how the 30-degree bit, because it's such a steep angle, it cuts all the way through the material. The 60-degree cuts a little bit, 90 shallower, and 120 much shallower. But you can also tell the resolution of the cutting here also is affected. The 30-degree bit, the letters themselves are not any wider. I mean, they stay within those vectors, but it cuts deeper. So it gives you more shadow, making it look deeper. That's why for small type or type that has a lot of filigree or a lot of serifs or a lot of sharp edges, using a 60-degree bit is a great go-to bit when you're having smaller details or smaller letters, because it will cut deeper to give you a better shadow area. The 120, which I rarely use on small signs because it cuts so shallow, it can almost be hard to see. But if you're doing large signage for the side of a building or something like that, well, then the 120 is nice because you can still get a V out of it without having to use a flat depth. That would be one reason to use this larger angle. 90, of course, is kind of a nice go-to for general purpose uses. But using this chart gives you some idea of how they respond differently. The other big effect that you have to watch for is that if your board is not perfectly level on the table, your lettering will either get deeper or shallower depending on which way and where you zeroed the Z. I give an example in one of my other machine webinars and using Virtual Zero. And Virtual Zero is an application with Independent or Ready to Control that allows you to modify your file by taking some points on this surface, and then Virtual Zero will actually tweak your file and adjust it so it carves level even though your board isn't level. But if you see your V-carving fading out or going too deep, be aware that this could be the result of it. Now, in critical situations, sometimes if I haven't used Virtual Zero, which is really probably the best option, but another option that I have used is I've very carefully loosened up the clamp on one of the corners of the project and, slipped a piece of paper or a business card under the low corner and actually went back and recarved it. And in a critical situation, I was actually successful doing that. You could also do that before you carve your project if you're not using Virtual Zero, where you could take the router bit to all four corners and measure the difference in your board thickness and then shim the board up before you clamp it down. So the top of the board at least is level when you start cutting. So a couple workarounds. Again, for most use, if your boards are generally level, you're not going to have a problem. But the Virtual Zero is certainly an option to consider. Okay, at this point, I want to hop into talking about vectors, and we're going to talk about vectors much in the same way we talked about the tool paths, where I want to show you some similarities between them so you understand some of the basic parameters that are the same. So we're going to look at these primary vectors up here, and starting out with the draw rectangle one, when you open up that position box, or the edit box for the draw rectangle, you have these various settings. And the first one is the anchor point. And we talked about that a little bit. The anchor point is where the rectangle is going to get drawn from. And right now, as you can see, it's set up at 0, 0. The size setting is the size of the rectangle that you want to draw. So be careful not to get those two entries confused. The anchor point is not the size, it's the position that it's going to draw that corner from. So it's going to draw the lower left corner starting at the 0, 0, which is essentially the same as your datum point. So here's an example. The anchor point is 0, 0, which also happens to be our datum point for the project because you can see a little light gray line right here. That means the data point is down here in the lower left, which is also going to be our anchor point for that rectangle. And there you can see how we have the data point set up to the lower left. Now, if we change something and we change the anchor point to 2 and 3, notice how the anchor point moves up, size of the rectangle remains the same, but now we've anchored that corner, that lower left corner, to 2 and 3. If we were to move the anchor point to the middle and create this rectangle, then this 2 and 3 would be in the middle of the square or the rectangle shape. Now here's another scenario. If our datum is set up to the middle of our project and our anchor point is 0, 0, which we used earlier, now the square is going to be, again, anchor point 0, 0, the same as our datum point 0, 0. In this case, that's the middle of the square. And again, much like we did with the other datum location, we can move that square over. But again, realizing that all the measurements, this anchor point is referenced from the datum point. So there's a lot going on here to keep in mind with the measurements. But once you understand what anchor point is, this applies to all of the tools. Take a look at this. So all of these tools have anchor points. Some of them, like to draw a circle, are called center point. The polygon is center point and the star is center point, but it really is the same thing. It's an anchor point. The ellipse and the rectangle allow you to choose the middle or the four corners for the anchor, where the other shapes you choose the center. So they all have a center point and they all have a size setting. So that's the comparison I wanted to show you, that all these tools have that similarity. Anchor point and size. These are two of the main functions you'll be dealing with when you set up a vector. Next, I want to look at the transform object tools here. And again, we have anchor point and position, which is sort of like size. But in this case, the position is your anchor point. And we've got absolute and relative. And what's important to realize is that the absolute measurement is measuring it from the datum. If you switch this to relative, it'll move that middle of that shape 3 inches and 2 inches from its current position. So it's relative to its current position, it'll move it. Every time you hit apply, it'll move it by that much if you're set up at relative. Move selection is quite handy because you can select a vector, whatever that shape is, and if you want to tweak it by a little amount or a lot, you can go in here and very precisely do that. So again, here you can see how the anchor point in set size, which is the next one over, which is similar to move, but set size is more like taking any given shape and you're going to, again, where do you want to change that size from? The anchor point, in this case, we're going to expand it equally from the middle. So if I go 2, 2, and I change that to 2, 3, it'll be equally expanded all the way around. On the set size tool, if I click the lower left and change these dimensions, it will anchor the lower left and stretch it the other 3 directions. So again, it's part of its terminology, it's part of its understanding how they're similar and different. Now, the one other thing in the set size tool, if you want to modify the size of an object, this link XY, if you leave that linked, it'll proportionately change both of these. So if I change this to 3, that will change to 3. If I unlink it, it will just change one or the other. Now, with many of the vectors, you can also highlight that vector and go back to the original tool that you used for that and change some of the settings in there. So there's, again, one of the challenges of using VCarve, there's multiple ways to get the job done. And so it takes a while to learn all those ways and determine which is most efficient in a given situation. But hopefully with this information on vector editing, you'll be able to at least draw some vectors, and now you have within your power to be able to go back and move them, change their size, and know and do it in a predictable way. Any questions about anchor point and setting size or moving? Okay, next up, I want to talk a bit about bitmap tracing. Bitmap tracing is something that I've covered in, again, a couple of my other webinars, but it's worth covering again here, and I'll because it's a very quick, easy way to create designs. Now, a bitmap is defined as one of these file types that you see down below here. Some, I don't see PDF here, but some PDFs fit in here. The thing that's interesting about PDFs, so let me back up just a second. Bitmap as opposed to vector files. A vector file imports as lines that are ready to use. All these lines that we draw in VCarve are called vector lines. They have nodes, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. They're a special kind of line format. Where bitmaps, you mostly can think of bitmaps as an image or a photograph or a piece of artwork like clip art. And they're all made up of pixels. If you zoom in on them, you see a lot of little tiny dots. And so the bitmap file image, these are all bitmaps. Some PDFs are also bitmaps, and they sometimes will import, and some PDFs are vectors. But we're going to talk about bitmap image use, and taking any of these, we can create files from them. But a couple of things worth looking at. First off, the leaf on the left is a bitmap, the leaf on the right is a bitmap. When you trace it, you get different results. And you can see that on the left there, because it's made up of lines, when you trace it, you get a line on both sides of that little black line above. Because VCarve sees that black line up here as a photograph, and it's going to trace it on both sides of it. So you'll end up with that. And sometimes that's desirable. That's how I created the leaf for that tray that I carved earlier. However, if you want a solid area, then you want to look for a solid bitmap, because as you can see here, the results are quite different. And again, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish with your project. But that's one of the things, what you start out with affects what you finish. Now, on this left one over here, in this one particularly, you potentially could go in and delete this inner line with the veins right there, and you basically would end up with the same thing as you have on the right. And on the right side, you could go back on this one, you could do an offset line and add some veins, and you could mimic the one on the left. So with a little bit of custom drawing in VCarve, you could, eventually get what you're after if the original artwork isn't exactly as you need it. This is an illustration that I use in my Getting Started webinar, and this shows a colored image that is then traced and then converted into the VCarving. In this case, what's being traced in the bitmap trace tool, you can select which color you want to trace. And in this case, I'm tracing the dark blue, which then gives me these lines, which then exports as the carving file, and I carve that on the CNC with the VCarve. Now, a couple of things that are important when you're choosing a bitmap. A solid color, a high contrast black and white, or high contrast color. You can see the resulting bitmap trace is pretty good for all of those, and quite usable, quite recognizable. However, if you try to do some sort of photograph, colored or black and white, these do not work out as well. You can see at the bottom there, they're mostly not very recognizable. The middle one a little bit, but certainly the two on the outside aren't very useful. In a case like this, this is where you would go back and actually start doing some manual tracing with the tools themselves. You could actually take these hands and manually trace lines around those, trace them around the bulb. It gets pretty involved, but I've done this for customers and myself in my own work. When I have a photograph that I really like, but it won't trace well, then you go to actually do the hand drawing. Bitmap tracing is just a shortcut to take an existing piece of high contrast clip art and very quickly convert it over. And it has lots of applications. Any questions about the bitmap tracing?
I got a question.
Yeah.
Sometimes I see carvings of people's faces. How do you, with all the detail in someone's face, how do you do all the changing it over to vectors?
Well, there's a couple of, so depending on if is this a V carving or a 3D carving?
Oh, I guess it'd be a 3D carving.
Yeah. So VCarve in Aspire has a photo to 3D carving option for converting a person's face to a 3D carving. I can't say that it's super good. Other ones that you're going to see out there that are really nice are probably professionally modeled by somebody.
Okay.
So there's no quick solution to that. That gets into the whole world of 3D modeling, 3D shape creation, which is a whole skill in its own. And that's where Aspire comes in. It can be used for that. But when you get into things like people's faces, it gets quite advanced and quite complicated. But there are people that will do that. And if you need something like that done. Okay, at this point, I'm going to hop over to the software. We're going to take a look at the actually the inlay, or rather the V carving I was talking about. Now we've seen how these two are done. We've seen how the light bulb is done. We've also seen how the boat would be just like the leaf. Okay, you would just trace around it. But the other one I want to point out is if we take a look at this one right here, this is just a little drawing I did at a hotel one night when I was doing a demo for a high school, a bunch of kids, and I just wanted something simple for them to cut some signs out on. So for a shape like that, let me take these, and I'm just going to draw those, trace it, drag this up. Now I'm going to show you a couple tricks here. So the only part of this drawing that I really need is this middle part. Now notice when I click off to the side how it almost disappears, and that's because there's a default setting for this to fade away at. The way you control that, or right click on this, right click, go down to appearance, and here's a slider, and I can change the fading amount. I think I'll just take that all the way up for now so we can see it. So that's the first thing I'm going to do with this drawing. The next thing I'm going to do is go in and draw a rectangle just around the part that I want, like that part right there. So there you can see I've got a rectangle. Now I hold the shift key down, select that rectangle by putting the tip of the cursor right on it, hold the shift key down and click on the bitmap. And I know the bitmap is selected because there's a pink line around the outer edge. So that way I know both of them are selected. Now I'm going to go into the crop tool right here. See the crop bitmap? As soon as I click on that, it crops out the middle of my bitmap. Now I've got to go back in and change the appearance again because it defaults back. Now I can select that bitmap, stretch that out, and I don't need that. Now this photo is pretty poor focus, or I've enlarged it so much that it's really losing its resolution. So this might be a little tricky, but let's give this a try. So now that I have that, I can use the bitmap trace tool just like I did with those other images by going right here. And I'm going to set it for black and white. Now let's see if okay, so here. So this is a good example of one that's going to be hard to trace because the resolution of that image is so poor. The original file was higher quality. So let's try something else here. Let's close this. I'm going to shrink that down. Not sure this will get much better, but let's try it. Okay, let's start there. Now, you see these extra spots. This is called noise, and I potentially can get rid of it by turning up my noise filter. I can also try and turn down my threshold right here a little bit. Okay, I'm going to try that, and let's preview it. Let's see, let me do something else here. I'm going to go with a really loose fit on this. That should smooth out some of these areas. The fading is the same setting we had before. You can see how the fading is going up and down. So let's preview that. Okay, you can see now how the loose fit went around the corners. I'm going to keep that. That's not too bad. Hit apply and close. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about selection. I've got my bitmap in here, which I don't need that anymore. So I can either delete it or I can hide it. if I go up under layers, we haven't talked much about layers yet, but if I click down on layers, you can see I've got a bitmap layer, which automatically shows up. So let's turn that off, and that'll hide that bitmap. So I don't need that any longer. Now I've got all these vectors. When I went into the bitmap tool, I had this group vectors selected down here. So that's why they are grouped. So that's why they're showing up solid pink. If I were to go in here, I don't necessarily want to ungroup them, but I could. So now I have separate vectors. Now a little selection trick here. If I draw my left click and draw a selection rectangle from left to right, everything that's inside my selection rectangle will be selected. Let's do that again, but if I only go over half of it, it doesn't select anything because I have to have it fully enclosed. However, if I go from the right to the left, all I have to do is touch the vectors for them to be selected. And that sometimes is handy because all I have to do is go up like this right here, and now I've got the outside vector selected. But if I want them both selected, I'll quickly do that. Okay, so now I'm going to zoom out. That's a really tiny image. So let's go in and go into our set size option. I'm going to stretch it from the middle. I'm going to link it. And my project, let's make this, see how this works out at about 14 inches wide. And let's, okay. So now the little app up here are alignments. If I open this up and I click on this one, it'll align it to the material and center left and right. Here's a little shortcut. If you'd like to use these tools a lot, and I do use them a lot, if you click on this checkbox right here and hit close, all those tools now, alignment objects are all located right here. You have to understand what these mean. The white ones right here mean that you're aligning your selection to the material, which is the white background. These other ones mean that you're aligning one object to another object. So in other words, if I select this first one, hold the shift key down and select that one, and I select this option, that option shows me that I want to align the first one selected to the left side of the next one. So watch what happens. So it moved that first one over and aligned it with the left side. So that's what these others do. It aligns one object or multiple objects to another object. But I'm going to undo that Z. Now for this project, I actually don't need this outside. Let me think, which one of these do I want? Yeah, I'm going to delete this outside one. And I now have a vector that I can go in, and if I want to tool path it, I could cut it out. I'll just use these default settings, preview it, and that way you can do whatever drawing you want. The only thing I'm missing on this one is that my original drawing for this, all of these details were a lot sharper. So you ended up with what looked like a very rustic sign that was quite nice. So again, give it a try. Just start with a higher quality photograph and you can create the outline for a rustic sign. You can go back and put text or do some carvings on there, anything like that. So that's the basic of bitmap tracing. Any questions about that? Okay, next up, let's take a look at, let's see here. Let's take a look at text creation. Now, your three main text tools are these three, and they're right up here at the left. This is a bit of a change from what was in the last version. In the last version, each of these three were a separate tool. They have now combined those all together. So let's start by just going in. Again, let me change this appearance with the right click so we can see that. Move that up. I'm going to go into the text tool right here. Select text up here. And when you select text, you can type something in here, text like that. You can see it appearing down here. Now, a couple settings you want to look at. If you have a lot of text to edit, you can open up this large edit and it'll open up a larger window. Now, the text editing creating text tool is kind of like a word processor, but kind of a low power word processor. So it does a pretty good job, but there's usually some editing that you may want to do later on. Type in something like that. Okay, let's click on that, highlight it up here. Now, in this line here, font type, always use TrueType when you're doing VCarve, because TrueType gives you this outline that you need for VCarving. The single line text, that single line text, that can be used for laser work and some types of carving and cutting, but generally you're always going to want the TrueType. So that's what you should stick with. The font choice is down in the list here, and pretty much every font you have in your computer should appear here. Not all fonts carve equally well. Some fonts have overlaps and disconnections, so you just have to do some tests to see how well they carve. But the basic fonts, like this is Times New Roman, it's a pretty reliable font. You, of course, can add bold or italics. Centering, left or right, you see these green points right here. That's where the centering is. So if I want it left, it aligns it. See, there's that green point right there is the starting point. Center, now that green point is right there at the middle of the bottom and the right. So be aware that if I were to, so if I like that, I want to add some more text down here. If I click like that, the green point's in the middle because it's center, there's left, and there's right. So depending on what you want. You can change the text height right here, which will automatically change the box size. You can also go back in and click on existing text and change its size as well just by typing it here. So let's, something like that. Anchor point, see the anchor point right there? The anchor point is going to anchor based on where your text alignment is. So let's do a left text alignment. That green point is the anchor point location. So if I change this to 0, 0, as you can see, it puts it up there at the tab. If I go back to center, it puts it like that. If I wanted, since this text height's an inch high, if I wanted that to be truly centered on my project, I could put in a -0.5 on the Y, and you can see how it drops it down. So lots of flexibility within the text options there. Close out of that. Next, I'm going to draw a shape. With that shape selected, I'll go back into text editing, and I'm going to click text in a box, and then I'm going to select that box like that. Now when I type, notice how the text fits the box. And if I do a return on it, insert my cursor and then hit the return key, it goes back up. Now, what's called the bounding box is this invisible box around the outside. And right now, my bounding box is set up. You have what are called margins. So if I click on none, it stretches it all the way out. If I put wide margins, it puts it way down. It's measuring off my original box. Again, you could do left. Let's put it at normal or none. I could do right or centered. So all those things apply. There's also some additional, let's go back to normal here for a second. There's also some additional options in here where if you want to stretch it, you can see how it'll stretch the line spacing to fit within the box. So you can play with those as well. And if I wanted actually said, you know, I don't like my original box, I want it to be actually 8 inches wide. So now you can see how the bounding box has stretched out 8 inches wide and the text has gone with it. So once you do that, this vector is just, it's no longer needed. I can still go back in to my editing up here, and it still is considered has a bounding box on it. So I can't change the text height in this type of setting. I can't convert it to regular text. It always has the bounding box. So you kind of have to give some thought to where you want to start out with. People will use this if they have to fit a certain amount of type in a certain size window, and they let it automatically scale it, and then they work with it from there. Now, a couple of hidden features within this. Notice that when I hold my cursor here, see the V and the arrows of the A? If I click my left click, notice how it's getting closer. If I want those real close like that, if I want to increase the spacing, I hold the shift key down and notice how those arrows switch out. Now I can go out. And if you want it to go in bigger jumps, you hold the shift and the control key down, and it takes really big jumps like that. You could also control the line spacing. Notice how I'm going closer with the line spacing, hold the control key down, it goes really fast. Hold the shift key down, it goes the other direction. So you can edit your text so it has a really nice layout. You know, that's kind of an interesting layout where the text is the same as the width at the bottom. So that's some of what you could do on that. So that's the basic for the text, creating basic text, text in a box, and line spacing. The other option with text that's fun to play with is to create a curve. We use the arc tool here, create this curve like this. Now I'm going to go into the curve, select the curve. Let's do text on a curve. So select a single line of text. This is really important. It has to be a single line. So this double line would not work. So I'm going to select that single line of text and then hold the shift key down and select the curve. And bingo, it goes right down on top of it. And so then within this setting, this is a pretty good fit, just the way it's set up. But what we could do is if we wanted to scale the text to fit the curve, notice how it's not all the way down to the edges. We could click that and it stretches it out a little bit more. We could also adjust it. So you got a lot of flexibility, just like before. Let's go down to right there. And then we could also adjust the text spacing. This is kind of an automatic. It adjusts all of them. So notice the text is getting smaller, but the spacing is getting greater. So let's increase this here. If we maintain text size, so that's close, and that's far apart. So again, a lot of flexibility there. Let's go back to our basic settings on that. Let's scale that down. Okay. Now notice it says above the curve, on the curve, below the curve. And you've got text on the other side. So you could flip it again. And again, it's just kind of doing the same. So if you want it upside down on top of the curve, you could actually do that. Offset distance has to do with you want to give some space to the curve. Let's type in 1/4 inch. And it puts a little space between it. And then you've got your basic alignment features here as well, left and right and center. And this last setting is if you want the letters to align with the curve or stay vertical. So there's vertical. Can get a little weird or odd in some situations, but sometimes it's kind of a fun design feature to use. And, take this down to the left, and you can see how it's climbing up the hill. Now, in a case like this, if you're actually trying to do that, then you could go in and try and let's see if we can get it to, let's increase our spacing a little here. There we go. So text at a curve gives you lots of options that way. If we go back in, let's just go back to our regular text tool on this. And now going back to the regular text tool, I could go in. Now notice how it converted back to the way it was, but I could go back in and adjust the spacing if I need to using that tool. So that's a quick overview of the text tool. Again, there's a lot of things you can do with it between basic text and curved text. The last thing that I want to show you on this is how right now this text is set up as a font. But if this middle option here, it converts it to curves or nodes. So right now it's solid lines because it looks like it's grouped. But if I go into the ungroup, there is no ungroup because it's a font. But if I convert this to curves or convert this to nodes like this, now notice how each one of these is a separate shape. It's no longer a font. These are strictly shapes. So I can't go back to the text tool and edit it. It won't recognize it. But when I do something like this, then I can get much more creative with it. If I want to, for those two, I probably would group those, create those together. You know, I could get in there. I could just do some strange stuff, whatever you like with it. And you can start to play with the text and have fun with it. So I could take that and tip it like that. And this is where creating custom signs and logos and putting some shape to it is fun. Any questions about the text tool?
I
Okay,
guess I got a question.
sure.
If you were to think of this Vectrix software somewhat like making an engineering drawing, can you make solid text that you don't want to carve at all, just for notations next to your objects, or?
I will often, for solid, yeah, so for notations, I sometimes will just go in, and that is one place where I'll use the single line.
Okay,
And I'll just go in and note. And see, that's a single line, but it's still, I use this one right here typically. And
Oh,
I'll just make
okay.
notes with that.
all
And
right.
then you can put that on a layer and give it a certain color. Sure. Anybody else? Okay, the last thing I want to look at tonight is called node editing. And node editing is in many ways, it's an advanced skill to develop in VCarve, but it also is really valuable and essential if you really need to edit your curves and your lines and such. So I like to show it to people, even though it takes a lot of practice to get used to how it works. You'll find it to be immensely valuable if you start doing a lot of custom work and a custom design. So what I have here, and I'm going to send you this chart. But to enter into node edit, you select your vector. Now, this is just a picture over here, but my drawing area is over here. I right click, and here's the node edit. The shortcut key is N. And when you node edit, the nodes show up. And each of those nodes, by their color and their shape, means something different. This hollow one here at the top is an arc node, as you can see over here. And if I grab that, it'll stretch that arc out to its maximum radius, like that. Or I can stretch it the other way to its maximum radius. So that's what that middle one does. This black one right here and this black one, this one in particular, this of course is connected to the radius right there, but this is a straight line between there. And you can see a little gray dot, you see, center hidden node. Those appear as straight dots because that's a midpoint. When I slide my cursor along the line, I get the line symbol below my cursor. When I get over to that midpoint, it turns into that square bullseye. If I left click, it reveals that node and I can stretch that. And now I have two new middle ones. So I can keep stretching those. And every time I stretch it, it splits that into a midpoint. So that's a straight line. I'll Control Z and go back to the original one. If we work our way to this corner, I have a straight line along here, but this shows me that I have a Bezier curve along this side. And just looking at something, yeah. So over here, this has a control arm. So notice how that controls that curve. This gets a little weird, like I said, when you start practicing with it, but I can do all kinds of things with it like that. This one right here is called a split node. I have two handles on it, but they're independent of each other. So that's how you would draw like that point right there. And I can grab that. And I can stretch that one out if I wanted to. Now, if I wanted this one between here to be a straight line, I can put the cursor on the tip so I get the line symbol, right click, and the things that it allow me to do with that line are right here. So what I want to do is switch that vector, that section, to a line, and bingo, it's a straight line. That differs from this one down here where you see the blue node. That has control arms that they're in a straight line and they act like a teeter-totter. They are connected. So I can stretch this one out, but if I bend one, the other one bends. There are lots of uses for this, but it gets a little tricky to control the length and the overlay. Notice this sweep right here. If I take it back like these back like this, I've got a very gentle curve, but I can make a very severe S curve, even to the point where it turns back on itself. It's nice to have continuous curves with very few nodes because it actually makes for smoother cutting on your machine. Every node that you have is registered by the G-code file, and if you have some situation, you'll end up with thousands of nodes. It'll actually slow your machine down because basically the machine is having to read every single node. But the other thing it does is that every time you have a node, there's a potential spot for a bump. So that's why it's good to remove nodes if you can. Okay, we've got another one-arm node here. We've got a straight line here. This green one represents the beginning point of the line. Even though this line is continuous all the way around like a circle, it has a start point. And there are some times that you want to change the start point. So you go over a node, you right click, and you say make start point. And the specific application for that has to do more with when you get to the tool pathing. But for now, just be aware that if your tool path is not starting where you want it to start, change the start point and your tool path will usually start there. You could also go in and cut the vector. And now also the start point jump back, because if I grab that, notice how I cut it. Now it's broken. And so that's how you can cut it if you want to change the shape for any reason. You could also go in and you can delete a span like that. You could go into this line here. You could change it to a Bezier. So now you've got control arms here and here. Or you could change it to an arc. So you got some arcs going on. You can insert a point any place you want. So that just insert it wherever the cursor was lying. So I'll undo that for a second. You could also delete vectors. I could go up here. Let's take this one right down here. Let's say I don't want that vector. I can hit the D key and it'll delete it. Let's say that this quarter right here, which right now is a sharp quarter, I wanted this to be rounded. I could go in here and hit smooth point, and it'll make it a Bezier, and it'll even it out. So a tremendous amount of flexibility in that. The star, there again, we can see the start point. Again, much like editing a letter, I could go in, if I enclose those two nodes, I could grab those and stretch those down like that. Or I could use the arrow keys in my keyboard and move those around. I could also, if you really want to do some fine tuning, I can right click on that, go down to properties, and it brings up a local menu to where I can do an absolute movement. This is its current position, absolutely speaking. So that means based on where the data point is, or relative, then I can move it. Let's say if I wanted to move, first of all use the absolute. Let's move that absolute to 5.5 by 5.5. Now watch when I hit apply. It tweaked it a little bit. I go back in again and I do relative, and let's go in the X direction by 1 inch, and bingo, it pops it out 1 inch. So lots of editing capabilities. You drill down into it. One more thing to consider is that sometimes you're drawing shapes. You end up with a shape. It's like, I really want these two vectors to be horizontal. So go into the node edit mode, select both of those vectors, hit the Y key because you want them to be aligned in the Y direction, and they will align. If I select those two and hit the X direction, the X key, they will align in the X direction. Now let's take these back in here again. If I select this one first, then hold the Shift key down and select that one and hit the X key, notice how the one that was selected first becomes the anchor point. So let's say I want this corner to be the anchor point. So I select that first, hold the Shift key down, hit that one, hit the X key, and it moves that out. Now I want that to remain the anchor point, so I'm going to select it again, go get this one, hit the Y key, it moves the second one down. This one I want to be the anchor point, so let's go get that one up there, hit the X key, and it moves it over. And now I want this to move down, and I want the right corner to be the anchor point. Shift key, X, whoops, wrong key, anchor point, select Y, hit the Y key, and it brings it back down. So that's just a simple example of aligning nodes, but you can align nodes even in a shape like this. If I wanted all four of those to be at the same level, I select all four of them, hit the Y key, and they all go to the same height. So node editing, I'm going to send you this chart. You'll also have this little diagram here showing you how to align nodes left and right. You'll have that as a handout that I'll send you. I know it's pretty advanced for some of you, but at some point, especially when you get into bitmap tracing, let me go back to the bitmap tracing and show you an example. Let's see here. Here we go. Bring up the bitmaps. See if I zoom in, you can see how fuzzy that edge is. Now, if I go in, I'll do a bitmap trace on that real quick. Preview, not too bad. Close. Did it save it? Nope. Let me try it again. Preview, apply. Forgot to apply. There we go. Let's just move that out of the way. Actually, I can just go up and turn off the bitmaps again. Now, these again are all grouped. So I'm going to go in and ungroup those. Now, if I go into node edit with the N key on my keyboard, you can see it's a pretty reasonable number. That's not too bad, but I've got some extra ones down here maybe. So again, here, if I hit the D key, it'll delete a couple of those. If I wanted the corner of the sail to be really pointed, I could go in and turn off the smoothing, which notice you can't see it hardly, but it turned from blue to black. And now those points are like that. And if I maybe don't want that one, I can get rid of it. So again, any given shape. So let me see another design here. There's one last thing I want to show you. Let's pick a shape. Yeah, let's pick. Let's see. I'll pick and let's go in and change that appearance up a little bit. That looks pretty good, actually. Okay, I mentioned about manually drawing. Now, this combines manual drawing with an image and some node editing. Now, there's all these drawing tools up here that you can use. I generally tell people, keep it simple to start with. And I just go in, click, there's a line. I click the low spot and the high spot. Now, there's one other thing that I haven't talked a lot about, but up here, these are snap features. I don't think of them in like magnetic points. We can talk more about those later, perhaps, but there's also good documentation at Metric on how these work. I like to turn these off because these tend to force the line horizontal or vertical or to other points. And I'm going to just hit these high points and a few of the low points. I'll just stop there for now. So then I go into node edit, and there's our basic nodes. Now I start using some of the tools that I just showed you, like up here. Here's a middle point. But rather than that, I'm going to make this into a Bezier curve by clicking Bezier. Now I've got some handles there. I can stretch around and see I can do the same thing here. If I want that really pointed, I could go down like that. And again, the B is the shortcut. So if I want to use my shortcut keys on my keyboard, I could actually just go in and hit the B key and get that. Now here's an interesting shape. Here's where I'm going to take and try and do a double curve on this. Something like that. And if you needed some additional, I could insert a point there, could draw that one down. And this is where you could end up with a compound curve in there if you needed it. Now, in this case, I actually brought one down already. If I take that, if I smooth that, now I have one at the bottom already and one at the top, giving me some options. Again, let's make this a Bezier. Curve that in a little bit. So you can see it doesn't take a lot of points. So this is kind, leaf has some added detail, but if I wanted a nice smooth shape to it, this works pretty well. The same would apply to the light bulb. If I had the light bulb in here, I could go in, and in this case, if I wanted to, I could actually start out with a circle here in the middle, like that. Node edit. And in this case, I would go ahead and insert a point at those edges. And then I would probably hit the L key to make that a line and a line. Stretch this down over here, grab the midpoint, and bingo, it goes that quick. And then if I want those two aligned, I highlight them, hit the Y key, and they're nicely aligned. So spend some time. Node editing is a little like learning to play piano. You got to get your hands coordinated, and it's a little tricky to start with, but the dividends it pays whenever you're doing custom layout, you want to tweak a design, it's tremendously valuable. Well, that about wraps it up for tonight. Questions from anybody?
Yeah, I have a question. What's the difference between using the offset tool or that boundary create? It looks like they both do the same.
Are you talking about, this is the offset tool right here
Yep.
versus the boundary create tool, which
Yep.
tool?
The one up there with the circle around it. Up in the edit objects.
Up here?
Down one line right there with the, fourth one over, that one.
Oh, that one. Okay. So, well, let's take and try it out. I'll show you. So let's create a couple of shapes. Okay, so this offset tool, if I select both those shapes, go into offset, we're going to go to the outside and let's do an offset of 0.5. And let's create sharp corners. Let's hit offset. That's how that turns out. Okay, so that's the offset tool. Now, you don't have to have multiple shapes created. I could have just one of those shapes and it would have just offset it around the single one. But I'm going to take those I'm going to take those shapes, move them over here, and then we'll go up to the one you were asking about, which is right here. Boundary create a new boundary vector around the selected vectors. Okay. All right, and boundary offset. We're going to do the same thing, 0.5, create, and notice how it does it. In this case, it does around both of them, and it's a smooth, there's no sharp corners to it, okay? You see the
Okay.
difference at this point?
Yep.
So let's take that off. Let's hit the rubber band boundary, and that creates that type of boundary.
Okay.
So it really amounts to, in the end, it's doing a very similar thing. The results are a little different depending on what you're trying to do.
I have one last question. Do you have to create a vector for, say you want to do a round over, like on that tray that you made earlier with the leaf? So if you wanted to do a round over on the outside edge, do you have to create a vector?
So if we had, okay, so here, let's take this shape. And we'll do an offset inward. Not much. So that's kind of the tray shape. Now, are you talking about doing a round over the outer edge or
Yes, or
the outer
either, either or, any
either?
edge.
Well, okay. Well, in this case, let's go ahead and set the toolpath up for this. First, I'll just take and do the pocket. So let's just do a 0.5 end mill. Let's just do that. Okay, there's our pocket, and then I'll go back and let's do the profile on the outside. There's our basic tray, and so you want to put a round over on the outside right there.
Yep.
Okay, for that, you do need the vector, and we have that vector, which is this outer line. For this case, this is an interesting application. You would go into the profile toolpath. Let's do well, we'll see what kind of tool. Let's go find our tool first. Now, in this case, this is going to be called a form tool. And these form tools are something that, let me see if I have another one up here. Here we go. At the 1/4 inch round over, okay?
Yep.
You have to create that, you have to create half of that design inside VCarve. These are all custom created bits based on your profile. So I don't have time to go over that tonight, but I will show you that once you select that bit can then be used on this area. So that was a 1/4 inch round over, which means if we go a 1/4 inch deep, it should give the correct round over. But the other thing you have to remember is that bit, when it's saying the outside, it's measuring to the outside. And if we do it on the line, it's going to go right to the middle. So I'm going to go to the outside of this, which means it's going to go right along that edge of the bit, but it's not going to cut anything. So I have to do a custom offset. Follow me and I'll show you. We'll go like this. I'm going to go right there. I'm going to go to the outside, and then I'm going to do, let's see, here, let's click this. I'm going to do a negative 0.25 offset, which will bring the router bit back in that amount. And this hopefully will do the trick. So there it is.
Oh, yeah.
Now, again, the thing you have to recognize, which is tricky, is that I had to add that negative offset because VCarve sees this edge as the outside of the bit. So I had to move it over a 1/4 of an inch.
So if you're doing it on the inside, you'd still do a negative?
So if I did it on the inside, I would have to move it over the width of this. Well, then it's going to think about this being the curve. So I'd have to move it over the distance of the curve and the distance of the bottom, which is probably a 1/2 inch.
Okay.
If I did it on the line, watch what happens. We'll go on the line for a minute. If I do it on the line, you can see it cuts right down.
Oh, yeah.
So that's where you have to offset it one way or the other.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Well, hopefully you guys find this helpful. I'll send this video out. I know there's a lot to digest here. If you have any questions, drop me an email, and hopefully see you next week. Have a good night.
Good night.